Welcome to today's Explainer. We are jumping straight into a deeply critical, highly debated piece of expert political analysis today. We're going to be looking at a really stark evaluation of current state failures and military strategy, brought forward by former Israeli Knesset speaker Avraham Burg. Now, his thesis is highly provocative. He's essentially arguing that recent military campaigns are fundamentally failing across the board, and he suggests that a strategic retreat might literally be the only viable path to long-term stability. If you're someone who follows the intricate mechanics of statecraft, this is an absolutely fascinating framework to explore. Our goal here today is to neutrally map out Burg's exact arguments, step by step, so we can really understand the mechanics of his critique and how it applies to broader geopolitical theory. So we're going to break this down into a 6-part thematic deconstruction. We'll start with multi-front failures, then look at the myth of absolute victory, the power of calculated loss, evaluating leadership, historical retreats, and finally, regional realities. All right, let's get into Section 1, multi-front military failures, focusing specifically on the tactical versus the strategic. Burg starts with a really foundational premise regarding the current state of conflict. He argues that recent operations might look like tactical wins in these isolated, on-the-ground moments, right? But when you zoom out and view them from a macro perspective, they actually add up to broad, undeniable strategic defeats. Let's look at how he breaks this down. In Gaza, the stated goal of absolute victory has, in Burg's assessment, just yielded an empty landscape of ruins and mourning, without actually altering the long-term security paradigm at all. Then you look at Lebanon. The aim to completely defeat Hezbollah has instead turned the northern occupied territories into a hell on earth, creating this massive crisis where displaced citizens are completely unable to safely return home. And regarding Iran, the primary objective there was long-term deterrence, but Burg actually labels the current reality a great deception. He sees it as a highly dangerous tightrope walk that risks pushing the state toward total systemic self-destruction, rather than actually projecting strength. So for Burg, these are not the hallmarks of a successful military campaign. They're draining quagmires. The sheer friction of fighting this kind of multi-front war is severely draining resources, degrading military readiness, and completely fracturing national focus. Between Gaza and Tehran, Israel has not won on any front. It's a very blunt thesis. Burg really doesn't mince words here. He views the entire multi-front military effort as an accumulating, catastrophic failure. And what's absolutely crucial to grasp about his perspective is the staggering opportunity cost of all this. He argues that this approach is just rapidly consuming enormous resources, it's costing thousands of lives, and perhaps most damaging for long-term survival, it's wasting vital diplomatic opportunities that might never come back around. Basically, every single day spent locked in a multi-front gridlock is a day that is not being spent building sustainable alliances. Moving on to Section 2. The myth of absolute victory, and the massive gap between rhetoric and reality. Burg points out this huge, dangerous canyon between the political rhetoric constantly coming from the leadership and the grim reality that citizens are actually experiencing day to day. He totally redefines the term absolute victory. Instead of treating it like a real, definable military endpoint, he categorizes it as a dangerous illusion. To him, it's essentially an empty theatrical performance. By demanding this impossible standard, where anything short of the total physical annihilation of an enemy is framed as a humiliating defeat, leaders are forcing the state into a perpetual state of war. Constantly chasing this unachievable, mythological standard functions almost like a drug for the populace. It demands more and more escalation while totally masking a devastating toll. It forces a state into permanent national exhaustion rather than producing any tangible, sustainable security. And the collateral damage of this prolonged confrontation goes way, way beyond the immediate physical battlefield. We're talking massive geopolitical ripple effects. Burg points to rising global energy prices, deepening regional instability that actually threatens neighboring previously stable governments, and of course, crushing domestic economic pressure. Crucially, though, Burg highlights the growing hostility within the United States Congress and the shifting tectonic plates of the American public. This erosion of political capital with a primary superpower is a massive strategic liability. Future Allied administrations are eventually going to face an immense dilemma. Who is actually going to pay the billions of dollars required for post-war reconstruction? Every prolonged, seemingly endless mission just chips away at those vital, foundational alliances that ensure a nation's long-term survival on the global stage. All right, Section 3. This is where we get into the core of the explainer. The power of calculated loss, or what Burg refers to as investing in retreat. So if the current path of absolute force is failing, what is the alternative? Burg suggests a highly counterintuitive solution. He says we need to rethink defeat entirely and intentionally invest in losing. He uses this brilliant conceptual analogy of a sumo wrestling match. Think about it purely in terms of the abstract physics of momentum, balance, and gravity. Imagine two massive, heavy forces leaning into each other with unyielding maximum power. It's a pure gridlock of energy. Neither side can break the other. But if one force makes a sudden strategic pivot, literally just stepping back at the exact right moment, the opposing force collapses entirely under its own massive weight and forward momentum. Burg argues a geopolitical entity can utilize this exact same physics. Stepping back isn't weakness. It's a calculated maneuver to dismantle your opponent's strategy, leaving them swinging at the air and fatally overextending their own resources. The key takeaway here is that a strategic retreat is not a surrender. As Burg puts it, what appears to be a loss may become the key to a real and sustainable victory. It is a deeply calculated, highly intentional method. Now, implementing this requires profound national self-awareness. You have to know exactly when the continuation of a war, driven purely by the sunk cost fallacy, becomes far more damaging to your own state's fabric than simply making a difficult, painful compromise. It requires recognizing that sometimes you literally have to lose a battle of pride in order to win the overarching war of survival. Let's pivot to Section 4, evaluating the current political leadership and the internal obstacles blocking this path. If this calculated loss is the logical, strategic path forward, you might be wondering, why on earth isn't it happening? Well, Burg argues the primary obstacle is entirely internal. He levels incredibly harsh criticisms at specific figures within the current cabinet. He labels Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as weak and fundamentally detached from macro strategy. Burg claims Netanyahu prioritizes image-making, media spectacle, and appeasing his political coalition way over the actual substantive security of the state. He assesses Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich as dangerously ignorant of geopolitical realities, pointing to a severe lack of understanding regarding how global economic and military forces actually intertwine. And he categorizes National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir as fundamentally reckless, engaging in incendiary actions that continually threaten to ignite multiple conflict fronts simultaneously. According to Burg's expert political analysis, this leadership relies entirely on empty theatrics rather than serious long-term strategic thinking. And all of this builds up to a pretty chilling conclusion from Burg. The person deciding that only a bigger war can save him from the failed war he already managed is the true danger. Burg is directly arguing here that leaders are using permanent confrontation strictly for their own political survival. They're addicted to conflict because living in a constant state of emergency keeps them in power and perfectly insulates them from domestic accountability. For anyone analyzing global politics, this is a crucial universal dynamic to watch for. It's the ultimate wag the dog scenario, where leaders become the real enemy inside the room because of establishing peace would fundamentally threaten their own authority and political lifespan. Section 5 takes us into historical models for strategic retreats, essentially knowing how to lose. Burg doesn't just present this as theory. He backs up his claims with hard historical evidence. He shows that knowing how to lose is actually a hallmark of successful, enduring states. Think back to 1812. Napoleon failed catastrophically. Why? Because he flatly refused to recognize the physical limits of his force. He blindly advanced forward toward Moscow, straight to his army's freezing ruin. Fast forward to the 1970s, the United States won countless tactical, on-the-ground battles in Vietnam. They had vastly superior firepower, but they ultimately lost the overarching war because they didn't know when to step back, draining their domestic economy and social cohesion in what was structurally an unwinnable scenario. Now, contrast these monumental failures with 1978. Former Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin strategically chose to return the massive, highly valuable Sinai Peninsula to Egypt under the Camp David Agreement. Begin gave up hard-won territory, crucial strategic depth, and extremely lucrative oil fields to secure a cold but ultimately highly stable peace treaty. Begin literally dismantled settlements and personally absorbed intense, vitriolic domestic political humiliation. He was furiously accused of cowardice and surrender by hardliners at the time. Yet Burg emphasizes that this short-term political humiliation secured long-term national survival by permanently removing a massive military threat from the southern border. Today, it's widely recognized as an absolute masterstroke of geopolitical strategy. Burg uses this history to contrast sharply with today's inflexible leadership. making the case that true leadership requires the rare courage to absorb a temporary, highly visible loss in order to secure a permanent, generational gain. And finally, Section 6, recognizing regional realities and escaping the trap of endless force. 88 million, that is the population of Iran. Burg uses this inescapable demographic fact to anchor a brutally pragmatic point. A massive nation of 88 million people is not going to magically disappear. It simply cannot be bombed out of existence, no matter the technological superiority of your weaponry. Endless fantasies of total regime change or complete subjugation through sheer military force are, he argues, entirely detached from physical reality. Demographics are destiny, and military force alone cannot permanently override geography. You just cannot vaporize the map. To survive in the long term, new, resilient diplomatic mechanisms have to be built. You simply cannot bomb away an ideology. More often than not, you just entrench it deeper. Eventually, all regional actors have to be accommodated to avoid endless, financially and morally draining instability. And look, there is immense historical precedent for this. Burg points to France and Germany. These are two nations that endured centuries of blood-soaked rivalry and devastating world wars, yet they ultimately formed the backbone of the European Union. Or look at India and Pakistan, fierce adversaries locked in a nuclear standoff, who nevertheless had to develop necessary backchannels of coexistence and diplomatic engagement just to prevent mutual annihilation. The ultimate unyielding reality of global politics dictates that eventually you have to find a functional way to live next to your enemies. Mechanisms, not just munitions, are what ensure survival. So, based on Avraham Burg's extensive geopolitical critique, the severe consequences of multi-front military failures, the systemic danger of prioritizing political theater over national substance, and the undeniable weight of regional demographics, we are left with one deeply challenging question. Is a calculated loss the only path left to a sustainable victory? It fundamentally challenges how modern nations wield power, how they navigate pride, and ultimately, how they define their own survival. Thank you so much for joining me for this analysis. Keep questioning the framework, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.